The moment the envelope arrived, the room fell into a suffocating silence. King Charles, seated at his polished mahogany desk, barely dared to breathe. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the flap, his eyes scanning the contents with disbelief. A simple piece of paper, a DNA report, yet it held a secret that could shake the monarchy to its core. And in that instant, the truth became unavoidable. Archie, the young boy adored by millions worldwide, was not Prince Harry's biological son. Not Harry's. Not the prince who had fought his own demons and carried the weight of royal expectation with such courage. The revelation, buried for years beneath layers of secrecy, whispers, and guarded smiles, had finally come to light. And now, everything would change. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The palace corridors, once echoing with quiet dignity and the muffled footsteps of duty, seemed to grow colder. Rumors that had circulated for months, hints dropped in hushed conversations, innuendo in tabloids and social media speculation, all converged into a single, undeniable truth. The DNA test had confirmed what no one wanted to admit aloud. It was a truth that would not only shock the royal family, but also ignite a firestorm across the world. How could a single result, a piece of scientific evidence, wield such power? And yet, here it was. The kind of secret that, once revealed, cannot be hidden again. Imagine being King Charles, accustomed to centuries of decorum and tradition, suddenly confronted with this level of betrayal. Could a father ever brace himself for such a revelation about his grandson? Could a man, who had spent decades navigating the intricate politics of the monarchy, find a strategy to manage a personal blow of this magnitude without fracturing entirely? The king's mind raced, calculating, recalling past indiscretions, weighing public perception, and wondering who had orchestrated the leak of this confidential information. And while his face remained composed, those around him sensed the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Meanwhile, across the ocean in the quiet of his California home, Prince Harry received the same shocking news. He stared at the report, his hands shaking, heart hammering, disbelief written across his face. For years, he had believed he understood his life, his family, his children. The bond he thought was unbreakable suddenly felt fragile, uncertain. Every photograph, every moment of laughter with Archie, every memory of bedtime stories and small victories now carried a weight he had never imagined. How could the boy he loved so fiercely, so unconditionally, not be his own? And yet, the scientific truth was absolute, unyielding, and impossible to ignore. The story did not begin with the DNA test. It had been years in the making, a tapestry of secrecy, misdirection, and perhaps even deception. Whispers of hidden relationships, private communications that had been carefully guarded, and subtle inconsistencies in public appearances all contributed to a tension that only now had culminated in this undeniable revelation. Each piece, small on its own, suddenly assembled into a puzzle that painted a picture more shocking than anyone could have anticipated. The palace staff, who had long maintained a facade of calm, suddenly felt the tremors of impending upheaval. Advisors conferred in secret, courtiers whispered behind closed doors, and media outlets braced for the storm that would inevitably break. For the public, this revelation was electrifying. Social media exploded with speculation. Headlines screamed across the internet, each more sensational than the last. How could this happen in the modern monarchy, in an era when transparency was supposedly valued, when every moment of a royal's life seemed under constant scrutiny? And yet, the DNA result had bypassed every layer of control. It was raw, unfiltered, and irreversible. Public opinion, already sharply divided, now faced a new dilemma: how to process a truth that challenged not just the narrative of one family, but the very perception of royal legitimacy. Would people sympathize with Harry, condemning those who kept the secret? Or would the monarchy itself face questions of credibility, loyalty, and trust that could reverberate for generations? Every family has secrets, but the stakes for a royal family are unlike any other. The monarchy is built on perception, tradition, and the illusion of stability. When that illusion is broken, even slightly, the consequences ripple outward in ways unimaginable. The revelation about Archie's paternity threatened more than private relationships. It threatened the very foundations of a centuries-old institution. Advisors debated whether to go public, how to manage the press, and how to shield Harry from a scandal that could define him not as a modern, progressive royal, but as a man blindsided by betrayal in the most public of arenas. And what of Meghan Markle? How did she respond in those critical moments? Was there fear, defiance, regret? Insiders would later claim that her private reaction was a mix of composed calculation and quiet fury, the kind of response that could either mitigate disaster or amplify it exponentially. The dynamic between Harry and Meghan, once portrayed as a united front against adversity, now faced its most formidable test. Would this revelation fracture their bond, or would it forge a new, albeit strained, alliance under pressure? As the story unfolded, questions multiplied. How had the DNA results been obtained? Who had authorized the test? How long had the secret been kept, and why? Was it a matter of protection, a misguided attempt to shield Harry from pain, or something far more calculated? The answers, slowly emerging from trusted sources, painted a picture more intricate than the public could have ever imagined. Each revelation came with its own shock, its own emotional spike, leaving those involved grappling with the implications. For King Charles, the implications were deeply personal. Not only was his grandson's identity in question, but the integrity of his family's legacy hung in the balance. Every decision he made from this point forward would be scrutinized by the world, every action dissected for meaning. A simple misstep could ignite controversy that might take decades to subside. And yet, as he sat in contemplation, weighing loyalty against truth, duty against emotion, he understood one thing clearly. The DNA result could not be ignored. It demanded action, clarity, and above all, discretion, an impossible balancing act in a world where secrets were increasingly difficult to keep. The palace buzzed with tension, the air thick with anticipation and unspoken dread. Courtiers moved cautiously, aware that the slightest slip could reveal more than intended. Advisors whispered about potential legal implications, public perception, and media strategy. The tension was palpable, yet behind every closed door, the emotional reality was far more profound. The human element, the feelings of betrayal, loss, confusion, and fear, loomed larger than any protocol, larger than any tradition. This was not merely a story of lineage. It was a story of trust shattered, of lives altered irrevocably, and of a family forced to confront a truth that had been carefully hidden for years. And the question that lingered in every mind, private and public alike, was simple yet devastating. What would happen next? How would Prince Harry reconcile with a truth that defied everything he believed about his life, his child, and his marriage? How would King Charles respond to a revelation that shook the core of the monarchy? And most importantly, how would the world react when it learned that one of its most beloved young royals might have a parentage shrouded in mystery, secrecy, and scandal? The answer, it seemed, was unfolding even as whispers traveled through Buckingham Palace, Los Angeles, and the corridors of power worldwide. And while speculation ran rampant, one thing remained certain: nothing would ever be the same. The DNA test had revealed a truth that could not be undone, a truth that demanded attention, action, and reckoning. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. How far would someone go to uncover a truth they weren't ready to hear? What lengths do people take when suspicion gnaws at the edges of certainty? For the royal family, accustomed to centuries of protocol and secrecy, the answer came in the form of a private DNA test. A single, innocuous swab that would unravel lives, reputations, and assumptions. It began quietly, almost invisibly. No press conferences, no leaked statements, just whispers in corridors, the careful movement of envelopes between trusted hands, and the ticking of a clock counting down to revelation. The test itself was unremarkable in appearance. A small envelope, sealed with discreet markings, carried inside it a swab and instructions so precise that even a minor misstep could render the results invalid. But beneath this simplicity lay a story of meticulous planning. Someone, somewhere, had decided that the truth could no longer remain buried. The reasons were murky. Was it protection, curiosity, or something darker, a need for leverage, a silent weapon to be held over the heads of those involved? Each possibility was more alarming than the last, because in the world of royalty, secrets are never just private. They have power, consequences, and consequences multiplied by media scrutiny. Prince Harry had little idea that this moment was approaching. He had always assumed, implicitly, that Archie was his son in every conceivable way. The bond was unshakable, or so he thought. But in the weeks leading up to the test, subtle shifts had begun to surface. Meghan had grown unusually protective of certain documents. Conversations had been more measured, and there were quiet phone calls that ended abruptly when Harry entered the room. Even the smallest inconsistencies. The timing of meetings, unexplained absences, whispered messages, now seemed loaded with meaning, warning signs of a truth that had been carefully hidden. When the test was finally administered, it was done in secrecy. No cameras, no witnesses beyond the most trusted advisors. The envelope that contained the swab and instructions was hand-delivered, accompanied by strict orders, absolute discretion. There was no margin for error, no room for leaks. In the palace, procedures are usually designed for appearances, state dinners, public ceremonies, and ceremonial protocol. But here, behind closed doors, a silent battle for clarity was underway. Each step of the process was documented in code, each name carefully redacted from official logs, because the stakes were not just personal, they were institutional. And yet, even as the test began, tension mounted. Those involved knew the outcome would not simply confirm expectations, it would force confrontation. It would demand decisions. It would reshape the landscape of family dynamics, public perception, and historical record. There was no way to predict exactly how anyone would react. Human emotion is unpredictable, and when it collides with truth, the results can be explosive. How would Harry handle it? How would Meghan respond? And how would King Charles, a man shaped by decades of royal duty and careful negotiation, maintain composure in the face of such personal upheaval? The process of sending the swab to the lab was itself a careful dance. Laboratories that specialize in such sensitive tests operate under layers of security, with analysts who understand that the slightest leak could ignite a firestorm. The swab was processed with precision, the results encrypted and delivered only to authorized personnel. Yet even in this controlled environment, human factors played a role. Analysts whispered among themselves, curious about the high-profile nature of the case. Security officers ensured no external communication interfered. Every email, phone call, and courier interaction was scrutinized. The palace had never faced a situation quite like this, where science intersected with scandal in such a raw and undeniable way. Days stretched into agonizing weeks as everyone waited for confirmation. The anticipation was unbearable, a gnawing presence in every interaction. Advisors walked the halls with the weight of unspoken knowledge. Courtiers noticed tension in gestures, a flicker of worry in eyes that usually projected calm. Even the mundane, afternoon tea, meetings with officials, ceremonial duties, felt fraught with latent significance. Each moment seemed to carry the potential for revelation. And behind it all, Harry and Meghan wrestled with unease, sensing that the fragile equilibrium of their lives was on the brink of collapse. Finally, the call came. Not a public announcement, not a press release, but a discreet, coded communication from the lab to the palace. The results were in. The envelope containing the official report was hand-delivered to King Charles in his private office. The moment was almost cinematic in its intensity. He broke the seal, unfolded the paper, and read each line with painstaking attention. The room was still. Silence was so profound it felt almost oppressive. And then, the truth hit. Archie was not Harry's biological son. The words on the page were clear, precise, and unambiguous. The emotional impact was immediate. Charles's eyes widened. His usually composed demeanor faltered. The weight of history, duty, and expectation pressed down on him. How does a man process the knowledge that his grandson's lineage is not what it appears to be? How does he reconcile love, responsibility, and duty with betrayal, secrecy, and deception? The questions spiraled, each more urgent than the last. And as he sat there, struggling to comprehend, he realized that the revelation was not just personal. It was a storm that would sweep across media outlets, social media platforms, and global conversations. Meanwhile, Prince Harry's world was about to shift irreversibly. The moment he saw the confirmation, every memory he had of Archie, the laughter, the milestones, the late-night whispers of love and comfort, suddenly carried a shadow. How could the child he adored not be his? How could a lifetime of connection, bonding, and parenting be called into question by a piece of scientific evidence? And yet, the truth was undeniable. Every instinct, every piece of emotion, collided with this fact, creating a maelstrom of disbelief and heartbreak. The palace, aware of the sensitivity, immediately went into crisis mode. Meetings were called behind closed doors. Legal advisors, communication specialists, and senior aides convened to decide how, or whether, to control the narrative. The problem was immediate. The DNA results could not be hidden. Information, once known, has a way of leaking, of finding the light no matter how much effort is invested in secrecy. And in a family where perception is everything, control of information can be the difference between measured management and full-blown scandal. Yet, even in this maelstrom, questions persisted. How long had the secret been hidden? Why had no one noticed the signs? Were there earlier tests, earlier doubts, carefully buried? And, crucially, who knew what? The palace is a fortress of information, but it is also a maze of human relationships, each with its own loyalties, fears, and ambitions. Unraveling a single strand could expose an entire network of knowledge, suspicion, and complicity. As the truth settled in, even those outside the immediate family sensed its gravity. The world would not wait. Social media, tabloids, and online forums began speculating almost immediately, though many had yet to see the confirmation. Every whisper became a headline, every rumor a trending topic. And yet, the most important players, the family themselves, remained under the intense pressure of managing emotion, optics, and consequence simultaneously. How does one parent react when the child they love is not genetically theirs? How does a monarch maintain authority when private family revelations threaten public trust? And through it all, one fact remained undeniable. A simple DNA test had changed everything. What seemed like a clinical process, a straightforward application of science, had become a catalyst for upheaval, an event that would ripple through history, culture, and personal relationships. The royal family would never be the same, and neither would public perception. One document, one sequence of letters and numbers, had disrupted a carefully curated world of appearances, loyalty, and legacy. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does a king do when the very foundation of his family's story begins to crumble beneath him? How does one maintain composure when a private truth threatens not only lineage, but legacy itself? For King Charles, the moment was seismic. The DNA report sat on his desk like a ticking bomb, each word a hammer striking against the careful structure of decades of royal expectation. His hands trembled slightly, though he would never admit it. The king's mind raced, flashing through a lifetime of duty, public appearances, and the immense weight of tradition. Nothing in his reign had prepared him for this, an internal storm triggered not by politics or policy, but by the intimate, irrevocable revelation about his grandson. Charles had always been a man of restraint, cultivated over years of scrutiny and relentless public expectation. He knew how to project calm even when anxiety clawed at his chest. Yet, this was different. This was personal. This was his family, and for the first time in decades, control seemed utterly out of reach. The palace, the staff, the protocols, all of it felt fragile under the sudden weight of truth. Could he call an emergency meeting without tipping off the press? Could he discuss the revelation with Harry and Meghan without igniting a private war in public view? Each question compounded the tension in the room. Advisors moved cautiously. Courtiers exchanged subtle glances, knowing that the king's expression, so carefully composed over the years, now betrayed a rare flicker of vulnerability. The royal household had faced crises before, scandals, leaks, political turmoil, but none so intimate, so emotionally charged. Charles knew that every word, every gesture, would be scrutinized, dissected, and reported. His reputation for poise and diplomacy hung in the balance alongside the fragile bonds of family. The tension was suffocating, and yet he could not afford to let it show. Imagine the scenario: a king, alone in his study, surrounded by the trappings of centuries of monarchy, reading a single document that could redefine the next generation. It was a private, quiet moment, yet one of unparalleled significance. Charles's eyes skimmed and reread the details, each line revealing the same harsh truth. Archie, the child he had watched grow, who carried the hopes and expectations of both family and public, was not Harry's biological son. The information was unambiguous, scientifically irrefutable, and yet emotionally devastating. The question that echoed through his mind was simple, terrifying, and unavoidable. What now? The king's initial reaction was disbelief. It was impossible, he thought. There had to be a mistake, an error, a misunderstanding. But the details were precise, the documentation flawless. The testing facility had followed protocol meticulously. Each sample had been verified, each result checked multiple times. There was no room for doubt. Charles felt the ground shift beneath him. This was no ordinary family dispute or minor indiscretion. It was a revelation with implications that would ripple far beyond private life. His advisors, sensing the gravity, moved carefully to manage both him and the situation. The palace's inner circle knew the potential fallout. The press would be relentless, the public reaction volatile, and internal loyalties tested. Legal experts began discussing options, weighing privacy laws against the inevitability of disclosure. Communications staff prepared contingencies for potential leaks. Every possible angle was being considered, yet the human element, the raw, emotional reaction of a father, grandfather, and monarch, remained unpredictable. Charles's mind flickered back to earlier moments, memories of Archie's birth, of Harry's excited anticipation, of Meghan's careful smile. Those moments now carried a weight of uncertainty, tinged with betrayal. How could such a bond, so seemingly certain, be upended by the simplest sequence of letters in a DNA report? The king wrestled with conflicting emotions. Love, shock, duty, anger, protectiveness, and, above all, the stark reality that this knowledge demanded action. As he considered his next steps, the complexity of the situation became clear. The revelation was not merely personal, it had public consequences. In a monarchy that relies on perception, lineage, and tradition, questions about legitimacy are explosive. How would the media react? How would the Commonwealth respond? What would be the reaction of other family members, including Prince William and Catherine, whose lives intersected intimately with Harry's? Every possible scenario seemed to stretch into multiple layers of complication, and each layer carried potential for public scandal and private devastation. Yet even in this whirlwind, Charles had to think strategically. This was not a moment for emotional indulgence. Decisions had to be made, timing considered, statements prepared. The stakes were immense. A wrong word could inflame the situation, a hasty decision could exacerbate tensions, and a miscalculated reaction could irreparably damage the monarchy's image. He needed clarity, counsel, and patience, qualities he had honed over decades. But even for someone so seasoned, the personal nature of this revelation made composure a fragile thing. And then there was Harry. How would he react? Charles knew his son was already under immense stress, balancing his public persona with private struggles. The knowledge that Archie might not be his biological child would be a shock beyond words. How could Charles approach this conversation? With gentleness, with firmness, with strategy? Each potential approach seemed fraught with risk. A wrong word might fracture trust. Silence could breed resentment. And yet, action could not be delayed indefinitely. Meanwhile, Meghan's role in all of this added another layer of complexity. Insiders suggested she had been aware of the possibility long before the test results were formalized. What did that mean for her relationship with Harry? For her standing within the palace? For Charles's perception of her as a daughter-in-law? Every element of the revelation intertwined, creating a knot of emotion, strategy, and consequence. The king felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him from all directions, both as a family member and as the sovereign of a centuries-old institution. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls pressing closer with the knowledge that the world outside would soon demand answers. Charles considered the delicate balance between secrecy and disclosure. The palace had protocols for scandals, for political crises, for leaks, but this was intensely personal, intensely private, and intensely volatile. The challenge was unprecedented: to navigate truth and loyalty, emotion and duty, without igniting a catastrophe. As hours passed, Charles convened his closest advisors. Discussions were hushed, deliberate, and laden with tension. Should the matter remain private until a plan was formulated? Should Harry be approached immediately, or allowed to discover the truth on his own terms? Every option carried risk, every decision had consequences. The king weighed the balance of power, the potential for public exposure, and the emotional state of his family. He understood that any misstep could have repercussions lasting decades. The gravity of the situation pressed in from every angle. Not only did it involve Harry and Meghan, but it also threatened to ripple across international relations. Allies, royal watchers, media outlets, and the public would scrutinize every move, every expression, every statement. The monarchy's image of stability and continuity was suddenly under threat, and Charles, as its figurehead, felt the immense weight of responsibility. And yet, amid the strategy and analysis, Charles could not escape the human side of the revelation. The bond he had always hoped for with Archie, the love, the guidance, the connection, was complicated now by a truth that no amount of protocol could soften. He felt a pang of protective instinct, a desire to shield his grandson from the storm, while simultaneously grappling with the consequences for his own role, his family's reputation, and the expectations of history. Then came the moment that changed everything. A private call from a source within the palace, a whisper confirming that Harry had seen the report. The dynamics shifted instantly. The conversation was brief, loaded with subtext, and yet devastating in its implications. The king realized that the truth could no longer be managed quietly. Its impact was immediate, irreversible, and profoundly personal. And as Charles leaned back in his chair, pale and contemplative, one thought dominated his mind. How does a father, a grandfather, and a king manage a truth so shocking, so intimate, so explosive, that it threatens everything he has built and believed in? The answer was unclear, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. The palace would never feel the same, the family dynamic would never be the same, and the world would never look at Archie in the same way again. But what happened the moment Harry confronted Charles in person? The reaction, the words, the tension. It would leave everyone watching in disbelief. What if everything you believed about someone you loved was a carefully constructed illusion? What if beneath the smiles, the public appearances, and the polished interviews, there were secrets that no one, not even the closest family members, could have imagined? For Meghan Markle, the DNA revelation was not just a shock for Harry, nor a challenge for King Charles. It was a turning point that exposed layers of her private life that had been meticulously guarded for years. And now, the world would begin to glimpse the contours of a life that had always been more complex and more controversial than anyone realized. The first whispers of Meghan's secretive behavior began to circulate months before the DNA results were confirmed. Staff members noted unusual phone calls that ended abruptly whenever someone entered the room. Emails were deleted, messages carefully curated, and private conversations often conducted in locations designed to ensure they could not be overheard. To the public, Meghan maintained an image of warmth, charisma, and modernity. But behind closed doors, her actions were anything but transparent. Each carefully orchestrated movement hinted at layers of information she preferred to keep hidden. Was it merely privacy, or something deeper, something calculated? Those closest to her described a duality that was as fascinating as it was disconcerting. On one hand, she was the devoted mother, the attentive spouse, the poised public figure whose smile could light up a room. On the other hand, she was a master of discretion, a strategist who understood the power of narrative and the potency of secrecy. Every detail of her life, every appearance, every statement, was filtered through the lens of perception. Yet even she could not fully anticipate how the DNA revelation would ignite scrutiny on the hidden facets of her world. Sources suggested that Meghan had cultivated relationships and maintained communications that few knew about. These were not merely casual acquaintances, but individuals whose involvement could have far-reaching consequences. Some were advisors with intimate knowledge of the palace inner workings. Others were outsiders with access to information that could shift public opinion, legal standing, and media coverage. How did these connections influence decisions made behind the scenes? What role did they play in shaping narratives, protecting reputations, or even manipulating events? Perhaps the most startling aspect of Meghan's private life was the meticulousness with which she managed appearances. Observers noted how she controlled access to events, how she curated social interactions, and how she anticipated the media's response to every move. Even casual outings were orchestrated to maintain image and influence perception. Yet the DNA revelation revealed that no amount of image management could shield reality from discovery. The facade, carefully maintained for years, had cracks that were now impossible to hide. Consider the psychological impact on Harry. He had always believed in transparency and honesty in their relationship. He trusted Meghan implicitly, relying on her guidance and counsel. And yet, the revelation about Archie's paternity forced him to confront a reality that challenged his assumptions. How could the woman he loved and supported for years have a secret of such magnitude? The emotional fallout was immediate. Confusion, anger, sorrow, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. The trust that had been a cornerstone of their relationship now required reevaluation, even as the couple navigated public expectations, media scrutiny, and the obligations of royal life. For the palace, the exposure of Meghan's secretive behavior represented a new challenge. Advisors quickly realized that managing Harry's reaction would not be enough. They had to consider how public disclosure, or leaks, might impact the monarchy's reputation. The balance between family loyalty and institutional integrity became delicate, each decision weighed against the potential for scandal. Every gesture, every statement, every public appearance now carried layers of consequence. The revelation about Archie's paternity was only the beginning. The ripple effects of Meghan's secretive life were just starting to reach the surface. Some insiders went further, claiming that Meghan's private communications included efforts to influence narratives surrounding Archie's upbringing. Reports suggested that decisions about schooling, public appearances, and even casual family moments were informed by a need to control perception. Was this purely strategic, or did it hint at a deeper awareness of the hidden truth regarding Archie's paternity? If so, then her actions were not just protective, they were preemptive. And preemptive actions, while subtle, have the power to shape outcomes in profound and lasting ways. The emotional stakes for Harry were compounded by the reality that the public had invested heavily in the Sussex narrative. From interviews to social media posts, from charitable initiatives to high-profile appearances, the story of Harry and Meghan had become larger than life. Yet now, behind the carefully staged moments, there was a tension, a question that could not be ignored. How much of the image presented to the world reflected reality, and how much was a carefully curated performance? The dissonance between appearance and reality intensified the emotional impact, forcing Harry to reconcile love, loyalty, and betrayal in real time. Even among palace staff, reactions were complex. Some were sympathetic to Meghan, recognizing the pressures of public life and the need for privacy. Others were alarmed by what they perceived as manipulation, a deliberate shaping of information to protect personal interests. These contrasting perspectives fueled internal debate, adding tension to an already charged environment. How could staff navigate loyalty to the family while managing their own ethical and emotional concerns? Each decision, each action, carried weight and potential consequence. The media, as expected, began to pick up on subtle hints almost immediately. Observers scrutinized patterns of behavior, noting discrepancies between statements and actions. Analysts dissected public appearances, social media interactions, and interviews, searching for clues about the hidden reality. Even casual statements by Meghan or her representatives were analyzed under a microscope, creating an atmosphere in which every detail seemed significant, every nuance potentially revelatory. The court of public opinion was awakening, and with it came intense pressure for clarity, transparency, and answers. Meanwhile, the palace faced the delicate task of balancing internal management with public perception. Strategies were developed to contain leaks, address speculation, and mitigate the impact on Harry, Meghan, and Archie. Legal advisors explored privacy protections, communications teams prepared statements, and senior officials evaluated potential outcomes. But despite these efforts, one truth remained inescapable. The revelation had already set off a chain reaction. The story had grown beyond any single individual, extending into the very fabric of royal life. And then there were the unanswered questions. Who had known the secret, and for how long? How had Meghan managed to maintain the facade for so many years? Were there others involved in the orchestration? Individuals whose influence could alter the trajectory of events? Each question added tension. Each speculation heightened the stakes. For the palace, for Harry, and for the public, the answers would not be simple, and they would not come quickly. As attention turned toward the implications of Meghan's secret life, the emotional stakes intensified. The revelation challenged assumptions about trust, loyalty, and the nature of relationships under the scrutiny of fame and expectation. It forced every observer, royal, staff member, and member of the public, to question the narratives they had accepted as truth. Could love and deception coexist in such close quarters? How would Harry respond? And what would the world think when the full scope of the hidden reality came to light? The answers were beginning to emerge, slowly, painfully, with consequences that no one could have fully anticipated. And while the public might speculate, and while the media might analyze, the most critical developments were unfolding behind closed doors, in whispered conversations, and in the private struggles of a family grappling with truths too profound to ignore. But what Harry discovered when he finally confronted Meghan, what words were exchanged, and what revelations came next, would leave even the closest advisors stunned, and it would redefine the narrative of their lives forever. Have you ever faced a moment where everything you believed about your life is suddenly questioned? For Prince Harry, that moment came not as a rumor, not as a whisper behind palace doors, but as a cold, irrefutable reality delivered in black and white. Archie, the child he had cherished, nurtured, and defended, was not his biological son. The confirmation of the DNA test tore through his world like a thunderclap in a still night. It was impossible to reconcile. The bond he felt with Archie seemed unshakable, undeniable, yet science told a story he hadn't expected, a story that forced him to question his assumptions, his marriage, and the very foundation of his family. The revelation reached him in stages. First came subtle hints, cryptic messages from palace insiders, and careful confidants. Then came whispers from Meghan herself, hints that something might not align as he had thought. And finally, the DNA report arrived. A document so sterile, so clinical, yet carrying consequences so deeply personal they could not be measured by words alone. Harry stared at it for what felt like hours, the letters blurring as his mind raced to comprehend the impossible. How could this be? How could the child he had rocked to sleep, watched grow, and promised to protect forever, not share his DNA? His initial reaction was disbelief. Surely there had been a mistake, a misreading, some error in the testing process. He called multiple contacts, verified procedures, asked questions that only added layers of anxiety. But each confirmation led to the same cold truth. Archie was not Harry's son in the biological sense. The emotional shock was compounded by the realization that this revelation was not only deeply personal, but also potentially explosive for the monarchy, for Meghan, and for himself. Every memory, every photograph, every milestone he had celebrated now carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. In private, Harry wrestled with a storm of conflicting emotions. Anger at the secrecy, grief for the bond he had assumed was unquestionable, confusion over what this meant for his marriage, and fear of public scrutiny all collided. He relived moments with Archie, first steps, bedtime stories, holidays, laughter, moments that now felt tinged with a strange, haunting uncertainty. Could love exist independently of biology? The answer seemed obvious, yet the emotional weight of the revelation made every interaction feel more fragile, more precarious. How do you parent a child when the very essence of that parent-child bond is suddenly called into question? The confrontation itself was inevitable. Harry could no longer sit silently, internalizing the shock while the world waited for him to react. One evening, in a private residence far from the prying eyes of the press, he summoned the courage to speak to Meghan. The tension was immediate, palpable, thick enough to choke the air in the room. Every glance, every pause, every word carried weight far beyond ordinary conversation. Harry's questions were precise, deliberate, and pointed. When did she know? Why hadn't he been told sooner? And most importantly, how could she let this happen without his knowledge? Meghan's response was a careful mix of emotion and calculation. She expressed shock, concern, and frustration at how the situation had unfolded, yet there was an unmistakable layer of strategic calm. She did not collapse into tears. She did not erupt into anger. Instead, she explained, defended, and, some would argue, maneuvered to maintain control over the narrative. The tension between raw emotional honesty and controlled explanation made the conversation both compelling and terrifying. Harry could sense that the situation was far more complex than a simple disclosure. There were hidden layers, motivations, and possibly preemptive strategies at play. Friends of the couple later described the confrontation as surreal. They noted how Harry oscillated between disbelief and sorrow, between anger and the desperate need to protect Archie from the fallout of the revelation. How do you process such news while simultaneously maintaining composure for the sake of a child? How do you navigate a marriage where trust has been challenged at its core, yet love and shared history remain? The answers are far from simple, and Harry's struggle to reconcile these conflicting emotions defined those early moments after the revelation. Meanwhile, the palace watched cautiously from a distance, aware that the private confrontation carried enormous implications. Charles and his advisors had to consider the ripple effects. What would happen if the conversation escalated? How would the public respond if any part of it leaked? Who could be trusted to maintain discretion? And most critically, how would Harry process the revelation in a way that preserved both personal dignity and public responsibility? The stakes could not have been higher. Complicating matters further was the question of perception versus reality. Harry had long been cast in the public eye as a figure navigating personal struggles while balancing duty, marriage, and fatherhood. Now, this private revelation threatened to disrupt that carefully maintained image. Could he emerge from this confrontation without the public interpreting it as scandal, drama, or betrayal? Could he reconcile private pain with public expectation, and do so without compromising either his dignity or Archie's well-being? Even as the conversation unfolded, Harry's mind traced potential outcomes. Would he confront the larger family? Should he seek mediation, legal counsel, or outside support? Could reconciliation with Meghan occur after such a fundamental truth had been revealed, or was this the beginning of an irreversible fracture? Every potential path seemed fraught with peril, and yet action was unavoidable. Silence was no longer an option. The revelation demanded response. As the confrontation drew on, emotional intensity escalated. Harry expressed vulnerability, frustration, and an urgent need for clarity. Meghan maintained her composed, strategic demeanor, balancing explanation with selective disclosure. The interplay of emotion and calculation created a dynamic that was both tense and revealing. Observers later commented on the delicate choreography required to navigate such a high-stakes discussion without tipping into irreparable conflict. Every word, every pause, every gesture had consequences, not only for the immediate family, but for the monarchy and the public narrative. In the midst of this tension, Harry was forced to confront not only Meghan's actions, but also his own assumptions, biases, and hopes. How had he missed the subtle signs, the hints that something was not entirely as it seemed? How had love, trust, and expectation blinded him to the reality now undeniable? The introspection was painful, yet unavoidable. The confrontation demanded honesty, reflection, and the courage to face a truth that challenged the very fabric of his life. And yet, while the private conversation was a turning point, it was only the beginning. The revelation's implications extended beyond personal relationships into legal, social, and institutional realms. Advisors whispered about potential fallout, strategies for managing public exposure, and the delicate balance between protecting Archie and preserving family cohesion. Every action Harry might take carried weight, and every decision was magnified by the inevitability of public interest. Finally, the conversation concluded, leaving both parties emotionally exhausted but acutely aware of the broader stakes. Harry's world had shifted irrevocably. The trust he had assumed, the certainty he had relied upon, the narrative he had embraced, all were destabilized by the simple, undeniable truth of the DNA test. How would he move forward? How would he reconcile love with betrayal, trust with evidence, and personal anguish with public responsibility. These questions would dominate the days, weeks, and months ahead. And just as Harry began to process the immediate impact of the confrontation, an unexpected development emerged. One that would escalate the tension further, pulling Charles, Meghan, and the rest of the family into a web of intrigue, secrecy, and revelation far beyond what anyone had imagined. What happens when a private family secret detonates into a public crisis? For the royal family, the revelation about Archie's paternity was more than just a personal shock. It was a trigger that sent the entire institution into a whirlwind of contingency planning, damage control, and tense private discussions. The palace, normally a bastion of protocol and tradition, became a hive of whispered meetings, hurried memos, and advisors calculating every possible ripple effect. Every member of the household, from senior aides to trusted courtiers, felt the pressure mounting, acutely aware that even the smallest misstep could ignite a media storm unlike any in living memory. The first signs of the crisis were subtle but unmistakable. Courtiers moved quickly, closing off access to certain areas, tightening security, and restricting information flow. The usual hum of palace life, footsteps in marble corridors, quiet conversations in antechambers, the soft shuffle of paperwork, shifted into a tense rhythm. Advisors consulted in hushed tones, discussing legal ramifications, communication strategies, and potential public perception. One misinterpreted statement, one leaked document, could transform a private family matter into a global scandal overnight. King Charles convened a meeting with his closest advisors, those he trusted implicitly to navigate both the personal and institutional ramifications of the revelation. The agenda was clear, though the stakes were unprecedented: contain the fallout, protect the monarchy's image, manage Harry's emotional state, and anticipate public and media reaction. The discussion was intense, strategic, and emotionally charged. Every scenario was examined, from private mediation between Harry and Meghan to the possibility of a controlled disclosure to the public. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the weight resting on every shoulder. Meanwhile, other members of the royal family were beginning to process the news in their own ways. Prince William, for instance, grappled with conflicting emotions, concern for his brother, worry about the institution, and a growing awareness that the family's private matters would inevitably become public spectacle. His conversations with Catherine were measured, careful, and infused with the unspoken understanding that every word, every glance, would be scrutinized. Family dynamics, once relatively predictable, had shifted into a volatile state, where loyalty, trust, and perception collided with unrelenting force. The palace's communications team moved swiftly, developing multiple contingencies in case the information leaked prematurely. Press statements were drafted, social media monitoring intensified, and potential questions from journalists anticipated. The team had to strike a delicate balance. Any public acknowledgement could trigger a media frenzy, yet silence could be interpreted as evasiveness or cover-up. The tension between transparency and discretion became a defining challenge for the royal household, forcing advisors to navigate an intricate landscape where every decision carried consequences. Legal counsel was also brought into high-level discussions. The revelation about Archie's paternity raised complex questions: custody, privacy rights, and potential public exposure. Lawyers debated how to manage the information without violating privacy laws, how to protect Archie from unwanted attention, and how to mitigate potential reputational damage for the monarchy. Each option was fraught with risk. A misstep could trigger legal challenges, media intrusion, or public backlash, further complicating an already volatile situation. In the midst of this orchestrated response, human emotion could not be ignored. Harry's reaction, private and raw, became a focal point of concern. Advisors worried about how he would process the unfolding events, how his decisions might impact public perception, and how tensions within the family could escalate. Meghan, too, was under scrutiny, her private demeanor, responses, and strategy assessed through both a personal and institutional lens. The palace recognized that the human element, the mix of anger, grief, and vulnerability, was as consequential as any legal or procedural maneuver. The crisis also prompted internal evaluations of security and information flow. Questions arose. Who had knowledge of the DNA test results before their confirmation? Could leaks be prevented? How should communications be managed internally to avoid misinformation, speculation, or inadvertent escalation? Every phone call, meeting, and memo became a potential point of vulnerability. The palace, a centuries-old institution built on secrecy and control, was suddenly navigating an environment where secrecy itself was under threat. In parallel, media speculation began to intensify. Although the official results had not yet been released publicly, reporters had already picked up on subtle cues, private discussions, and leaked whispers. Analysts dissected every public appearance, every minor statement, searching for signs of tension, contradiction, or confirmation. The palace understood that even without disclosure, public attention would soon force action. The revelation, private as it might have been intended, was on the verge of becoming a global story. The crisis also revealed fractures within the household itself. Allies and confidants of Harry and Meghan debated how to respond, some advocating for immediate disclosure, others urging restraint. Loyalties were tested as advisors weighed personal relationships against institutional duty. Each decision carried emotional, social, and professional consequences, further heightening the intensity of the situation. The palace, while accustomed to managing crises, faced a uniquely personal challenge, navigating not only the public narrative but the private emotional fallout for its own members. As tensions escalated, the king faced difficult decisions. He had to balance his role as a father and grandfather with his responsibility as sovereign. Protecting Archie became a priority, yet he also had to consider how decisions would be interpreted by the public and media. Timing, phrasing, and action all required precise calibration. Even a minor misstep could ignite speculation, criticism, and possibly irreversible damage. Charles understood that the stakes were extraordinary, both personally and institutionally. Adding to the pressure was the global attention on the family. The royal family, as a symbol of continuity, stability, and tradition, faced unprecedented scrutiny. Every rumor, every leak, every subtle gesture became a point of analysis. The revelation about Archie's paternity threatened not just relationships, but the very perception of the monarchy as a cohesive and principled institution. Advisors worked feverishly to anticipate every outcome, weighing the balance between discretion and transparency, privacy and accountability. Amidst the crisis, Harry and Meghan's private communications were monitored and guided by trusted advisors. The couple's emotional state, decision-making, and public interactions became a central focus. The palace recognized that while the DNA test was the catalyst, the unfolding human response would shape the narrative far more than any document could. Every reaction, whether public or private, was a potential turning point. Yet even with all precautions, one truth remained. The crisis could not be contained indefinitely. The public, the press, and social media were already sensing that something significant had occurred. The palace's meticulous control of information was being challenged by human emotion, curiosity, and the inevitability of disclosure. Every decision became a balancing act, every conversation fraught with tension, and every moment a potential inflection point. And just as advisors began to formulate a comprehensive response plan, a new development emerged, an unexpected leak that threatened to expose not only the revelation about Archie, but also the hidden dynamics of Meghan's private communications. This leak would force the royal family to act faster than anticipated, escalate the crisis to new heights, and place Harry, Meghan, and Charles in an emotional and strategic pressure cooker from which there would be no easy escape. What happens when a private family revelation ignites a global firestorm? The moment the news about Archie's paternity began to surface, even subtly, the world's media engines roared to life. Headlines, social media threads, and viral posts multiplied faster than anyone in the palace could anticipate. The revelation wasn't just shocking. It was combustible, striking at the heart of the royal family's carefully maintained image, and the consequences were instantaneous. The media frenzy was not just inevitable, it was relentless. Even before formal disclosure, whispers traveled. Royal watchers, journalists, and online sleuths picked up on tiny inconsistencies, brief statements by aides, unusual travel patterns, and cryptic social media posts that hinted at tension. Rumors that might have previously been dismissed as speculation suddenly carried a weight of credibility. Every public appearance by Harry or Meghan was analyzed under a microscope. Their smiles, gestures, even timing were dissected for evidence of stress, fear, or guilt. Analysts debated the implications of every move. Every photograph, every glance, every subtle sigh became a potential headline. Social media was instantaneous, unfiltered, and merciless. Fans, critics, and casual observers flooded Twitter, Instagram, and online forums with theories, accusations, and commentary. Memes emerged, some humorous, others biting, all reflecting public fascination and shock. In real time, the palace could watch global sentiment twist and turn. Was public sympathy leaning toward Harry, toward Meghan, or toward the monarchy itself? The online conversation became a barometer of opinion, unpredictable, chaotic, and unrelenting. Traditional media outlets were no less aggressive. Tabloids, newspapers, and online publications scrambled to confirm sources, uncover hidden narratives, and obtain exclusive reactions. Headlines ran wild with speculation. Archie's parentage questioned. Royal family in turmoil. DNA bombshell rocks the House of Windsor. Harry and Meghan. Family secrets exposed. The story was everywhere, the curiosity gap complete, and public attention undivided. Analysts noted the unprecedented velocity of engagement, the voracious appetite for every detail, and the mounting pressure on the family to respond, or risk narrative control slipping completely. Behind the scenes, the palace communications team worked tirelessly, attempting to manage the frenzy. Multiple contingency plans were implemented, statements were prepared, advisors monitored social media trends, and legal counsel reviewed every potential disclosure for compliance and consequence. But the volume of information, speculation, and public commentary was staggering. Every movement of Harry and Meghan became news, every private action at risk of being misconstrued. The palace understood that even silence was a form of communication, and every pause, every delay, could be interpreted as evasiveness or confirmation. For Harry and Meghan, the media frenzy compounded personal turmoil. Harry, still grappling with the revelation about Archie's paternity, now faced public speculation on an unprecedented scale. His grief, anger, and confusion were amplified by the knowledge that millions of people worldwide were watching, judging, and theorizing. Meghan, similarly, had to navigate the twin pressures of protecting her child and managing the scrutiny of her own life, now analyzed with the lens of suspicion and intrigue. Every post, every appearance, every word had consequences far beyond the private sphere. Compounding matters were global audiences. Unlike private scandals of the past, today's information landscape is instantaneous and universal. News about Archie's paternity spread across continents within minutes, transcending borders, languages, and time zones. Royal watchers in London, fans in Los Angeles, journalists in Sydney, and social media users in Nairobi all converged on a single narrative. Public opinion was forming, shifting, and hardening before the palace could fully respond. Every minor slip, every perceived contradiction, risked further igniting the narrative. Within this environment, speculation about Meghan's private life intensified. Reports suggested she had been aware of the possibility for some time, and her actions were now analyzed through this lens. How had she managed relationships, appearances, and private communications? Had she strategically curated public perception to delay discovery? Observers dissected even the smallest details, piecing together a mosaic of behavior that suggested foresight, planning, or perhaps even manipulation. The line between protective discretion and strategic concealment blurred, creating a narrative rich with intrigue, contradiction, and drama. Harry's emotional state was under the same relentless scrutiny. Analysts noted body language in public appearances, tone in interviews, and patterns in social media statements. Every detail of his demeanor became a data point, interpreted for signs of anger, betrayal, or composure. The emotional intensity was magnified by the knowledge that millions of people were watching, anticipating, and passing judgment. The private struggle of a father confronting a shocking truth was now a global spectacle. What happens when a private revelation threatens not just hearts, but centuries of law, tradition, and institutional hierarchy. For the royal family, the DNA confirmation regarding Archie was more than a personal shock. It raised questions that could reshape the very structure of succession, inheritance, and legal standing within one of the most scrutinized institutions in history. Suddenly, what had been a personal family matter became a matter of constitutional significance, a puzzle of legal precedents and centuries-old protocols. The moment the DNA results were confirmed, legal advisors convened emergency sessions behind closed palace doors. The objective was clear: assess the implications for succession, property rights, and potential public disclosures. These were not trivial matters. In the United Kingdom, succession laws, established through generations of tradition and codified statutes,